Thank you for your patience. Oh, we made you wait yet again. Sorry. My name is Penny Wright. We're delighted to have you all here. Just make a couple of quick announcements. One is that our November newsletter recently came out. If you live in our district, you probably have one. But if you don't, please do take a newsletter because we love having you at all of our events. Couple of quick mentions. Sort of World War II or history related. We have Tom Clavin and Phil Keith coming in 2 weeks to talk about their book, All Blood Runs Red. And this book will be reviewed, I think, on the front page of this Sunday's book review in the New York Times. And so I do hope you'll come to that. Just a movie, sort of more history related, to commemorate I think it's the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. We're showing, having a screening of Goodbye Lenin. Have any of you seen this movie? Just come see it, it's just great. I saw it in Sag Harbor years ago, and I have been waiting for the 30th anniversary to show it again. Okay. Patricia Del Giorno has been a speaker here. She's very good. She lives on the North Fork. She's interested in history, interested in women's history, and she's coming next Wednesday to talk about war correspondence, women war correspondence. Not just World War II, but some in World War II and other conflicts around the world. And the last thing I'll mention is a program that is facilitated by Dr. Martin Levinson, and that is our series of discussions sponsored by the Foreign Policy Association called Great Decisions. They run these discussions at various different libraries, and we run one, and it's once a month on a Monday. And the next Monday session is on the 18th of November, and the topic will be State of the State Department. So, is that timely? So, hope you'll come. They're next door. Yes?
Could you repeat that? State?
The state of the State Department and diplomacy.
State Department.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Martin Levinson is the president of the Institute of General Semantics, which is a think tank based in New York City, and is the author of 9 books on a range of topics that include academic research on drug problems and policies to social satire. He's also worked as a school teacher, an administrator, and a lecturer on historical topics, yeah. He's been a frequent speaker here at the library, and we're very happy to count him as one of our very good library friends. Please welcome Martin Levinson.
Okay, so thank you and welcome to the lecture. We're going to be talking about World War II. This year is the 80th anniversary of World War II, but only if you date it from the September 1st, 1939 invasion of Poland, which I guess was a month ago, September. But actually you could date World War II from other dates also. You could date it from World War I. Some people actually call it the 30 Years' War. In other words, they say World War I really never ended. It was World War I and World War II because the Germans never thought World War I was over. In fact, they were very upset with the reparations that were put on them, and so that was one of the reasons why Hitler came to power, because he was arguing that, wow, we can't pay these reparations, plus why did we lose the war? It wasn't us. And actually, what happened at the end of World War I, the war really was not fought in Germany. It was fought in Belgium, it was fought in France, and the German homeland was basically intact. Not much bombing, hardly any. The buildings were there. The civilians really didn't see the war. They were hungry because there was rationing. But basically, the troops moved back or marched back after the war was over, uniforms on, and the German civilians said, "What happened?" And so Hitler said, "Well, we were sold out. We were stabbed in the back." That was the expression he used. And who stabbed them in the back? It was the communists. It was the Jews. It was the liberals. So people rallied to the cause. And during the 20s, Hitler gained some notoriety, although not that much. It wasn't until the 1930s that Hitler gained more notoriety, basically because the German economy was so bad. had the German economy been better, the Germans probably would have paid the reparations off. But the German economy was terrible, depression hit, money wasn't worth anything. I don't know, when I was a kid, we used to see pictures of Germans going to buy bread, and they had wheelbarrows full of money just to buy a loaf of bread. I mean, the money wasn't worth anything. So basically what happened is Hitler said, wow, look, the economics are bad here. We really should have won that First World War. Rally around me. And at the time Hitler was elected into office, there was 50% unemployment among young German men. So you can see where people are angry, and they rallied around Hitler, and he was elected. He didn't just take over power. And so that was it. Anyway, before I go on to the rest of my lecture, I'm going to show you just briefly 12 minutes of a video. And this is a video basically of, that was put together during World War II by Frank Capra. Probably seen some of his movies, right? It's a Wonderful Life, etc. And he did a lot of propaganda films for the United States, because the idea was we were trying to explain to the troops what an important war this was. And by the way, World War II is sometimes called the Good War. The reason it's called the Good War is because the nation was behind the war. I mean, there are very few people who thought we shouldn't fight World War II. Obviously, because we were attacked by the Japanese, so once you're attacked, you feel you're justified to go against your attacker. You know, that really hasn't happened in our latest wars, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. You know, there's been real divisiveness, but not in World War II. So let's see about 10 or 12 minutes of the video, so cue it. Do it. Let's.
On September the 1st, 1959, an action.
Sound louder? Turn it up.
England and France had a treaty with Poland. Would they act now?
Adolf Hitler's all-out attack on Poland makes the long-dreaded European war uncertain. Prime Minister Chamberlain of Great Britain gave the Nazi dictator a 0 hour for withdrawing his troops from Poland. That 0 hour ends now. At this time, we transfer you to London for an important announcement by the British Prime Minister.
Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honorable settlement between Germany and Poland, but Hitler would not have it. The situation in which no word given by Germany's ruler could be trusted, and no people or country could feel itself safe, had become intolerable. Now may God bless you all, and may He defend the right, for it is evil things that we shall be fighting against. And against them I am certain that the right will prevail.
6 hours after Great Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, the Republic of France followed. All France is in a maelstrom of activity. The Maginot Line has already opened fire on the Germans. The sparring is ended. World War II has begun.
At home, we were asked, what country do you consider responsible for causing this war? Germany, 82%. We Americans had no doubt who started. Also, we began to fear that this war was going to concern us. President Roosevelt called a special session of Congress to reconsider the embargo against selling munitions.
I have asked the Congress to reassemble an extraordinary session in order that it may consider and act on changes in armed neutrality law.
The men of Congress wrestled with their beliefs and our futures. They debated and they argued.
The arms embargo is far too great a security. Embargo Act, as it now stands, is one-sided and works entirely to the advantage of one side. Therefore, the Embargo Act should be modified.
We the people also debated and argued whether we should sell arms and munitions. When the question was put to us, we had an answer. Should we change the Neutrality Act so we can sell war supplies? Yes, 57%. Shortly after, our representatives changed the Neutrality Act. We lifted the embargo on arms and munitions. Now we would sell, if purchasers would pay and take the stuff away in their own ships. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, Japan was busy trying to bomb, shoot, and terrorize the Chinese into submission. We began to realize that if Japan conquered 400 million Chinese, she might become so strong as to run us right out of the Pacific. You will remember that 2 years earlier, in September 1937, when we were asked, in the present fight between Japan and China, are your sympathies with either side? Only 43% were with China. Most of us were undecided. In June 1939, when we were asked the same question, 74% said we were with China. Now our minds were made up. When we loaded our scrap iron on Japanese ships, our citizens protested. Let Mr. Atchison, Assistant Secretary of State, tell us the inside of the story.
So until the middle of 1940, the restriction of exports to Japan took the form of moral embargoes of aeroplanes and direct munitions. Then Congress passed the Export Control Act, and increasing cutoffs of scrap iron, aviation gasoline, and other strategic items followed. Exports were curtailed to the limit which those responsible for our defense were willing to risk. It was a fearful responsibility. On one side was the possibility, in fact, the probability, that one day these materials might be used against us. On the other side was the possibility, in fact, the probability, that to cut them off would provoke an attack which we were not then prepared to resist. Finally, in the summer of 1941, as it became clear that Japan was turning her back upon every possibility of reconciliation and adjustment, and was determined upon her great gamble of conquest, all exports ceased.
The leaders of Nazi Germany shifted their war machine into high gear. They overran into Denmark. They smashed into Norway. On May the 10th, 1940, they blitzed into Holland and Belgium.
The Nazis are marching ahead at the fastest speed a conquering army has moved in all history. All roads in France are choked with slow-moving masses of refugees. Nazis with dive bombers are scraping and bombing thousands of helpless women and children.
Mr. Goldenborg.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight, it seems clearly apparent that the first great phase of the war in the West has been won by Germany. The army of French and British has made a valiant battle in its effort to retreat to Dunkirk, where there is some slight chance that some part of it can be evacuated.
Adolf Hitler's mechanized forces are racing toward Paris as French resistance collapses.
On this 10th day of June, 1940, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
This is William L. Shirer speaking from the forest of Compiègne, where Adolf Hitler today is handing his armistice terms to France. It is 3:15 p.m. Adolf Hitler strides slowly toward the little clearing. I can see his face, his gray, solemn, yet brimming with revenge. Off to one side is a large statue of Marshal Foch. Hitler does not appear to see it. Now we see the French walking down the avenue, led by General Hunsinger. Hitler and the other German leaders rise at the French avenue. General Keitel reads the preamble to the German armistice terms. This whole ceremony is over in a quarter of an hour.
Her heart was warm and gay. I heard the laughter of her heart in every sweet cafe. The last time I saw Paris, a tree was dressed for spring, and lovers walked beneath those trees, and birds found songs to sing. I danced the same old sexy dance that I had danced for years. The chorus no matter how they try, I remember
Conquering armies now stood on the shores of the Atlantic. The danger was suddenly close. Countries conquered by the Nazis had possessions outside of Europe. Some of these possessions are in America. Would the Nazis demand the French naval units at Martinique? Would the Nazis move into the Dutch oil fields at Curacao? Would the Nazis seize the French naval base at Dakar for invasion of South America? Already in Brazil, there were over 1 million Germans who lived exactly as they did in Germany. 1,200 German schools with Nazi textbooks and Nazi teachers. Nazi newspapers. Hermann Goering glider clubs had been established. Also in Brazil, there were 260,000 Japanese taking orders from Japan. In Ecuador, within easy bombing range of the Panama Canal, German airlines had been established. German pilots were reserve officers of the Luftwaffe. The German transport planes had bomb racks already built in. In Argentina, German athletic clubs similar to the Hitler Youth.
Okay, so that gives you kind of a flavor. This is Frank Capra trying to explain the war to Americans because we get in there and some people need to have an explanation. At any event, let me start with the lecture, and then my plan is to do about a 20-25 minute talk and have time for questions and answers. Okay, so World War II was a global war that lasted from 1939 to 1945. Again, you could argue from World War I, but for this purposes, we'll say 1939. It was the deadliest conflict in human history, marked by approximately 60 to 70 million fatalities, most of whom were in the Soviet Union and China. The Soviet Union lost about 27 million people, China about 20 million. From September 1939 to August 1945, 27,000 people a day died. The war involved 9 countries on the Axis side and 49 countries on the Allied side. Some say World War II was a European Civil War, and that was the thing for World War I, the 30 Years' War, which I just went over with you. The Japanese fought on the Allied side in World War I, and they were resentful, like the Germans, that they should have been awarded, well, for different reasons. They were resentful that they felt they should have been awarded more land after World War I, and they also felt that Woodrow Wilson, who was the president during World War I, was somewhat of a racist, in that he wasn't treating the Japanese fairly as he was the white folks. So in any event, they were upset about that, and in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, which is in China. Now, Japan invaded Manchuria because they felt they needed a sphere of influence, and they said, look, we can go into China. The United States said hands off South America. You had the Spanish-American War. The Europeans invaded different countries and had colonies, and the Japanese said, well, why can't we do the same thing? And basically we said hands off because we were worried, A, that the Japanese would take over areas in the Pacific and they'd restrict our travel there. And also the Dutch and the English and the French had colonies over there. We didn't want to lose them to the Japanese, so we put on an embargo, an oil embargo and a steel embargo against Japan in the 30s. Now the Japanese, if that embargo had stayed, probably could not have operated. So they knew one way or the other, if they wanted to be in China, they would have to go against the United States. And that was the reason for Pearl Harbor. Just quickly, Pearl Harbor was an attack, of course, December 7th, 1941. And there's some controversy about whether Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president at the time, knew about the attack. Have you read books about that or heard about that Franklin Roosevelt knew about that attack in advance? I don't think so. But, you could write a book about it, people will read it, there's all kinds of books on conspiracies, etc. In fact, we figured, from what I've read, we figured that we were going to be attacked by Japan one day or another. But most of the military thought the attack wouldn't be at Pearl Harbor. They thought the attack would come in the Philippines, because it's closer to Japan, and we were preparing for an attack on the Philippines. No one foresaw that the Japanese would get far enough in the ocean to attack at Pearl Harbor. We didn't think they had aircraft carriers, A, they could even get there, and B, they would be discovered. And the problem really was that they weren't discovered, which was sad because the planes that were flying, our planes that were flying around there just didn't see the fleet. And although we did see on radar the Japanese bombers coming into Pearl Harbor, they were misidentified as Allied planes. So we thought there were bombers coming in from California, from the U.S. Air Force. So it was just a sad thing. The good thing was, although we lost many ships at Pearl Harbor, they were basically battleships. The aircraft carriers were not in port when the Japanese made the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was really lucky for us because 6 months later at the Battle of Midway, the Japanese suffered a huge defeat by our aircraft carriers, by the planes flying off the aircraft carriers that would bomb the Japanese ships. And in fact, most of the big naval battles of World War II were aircraft battles fought off aircraft carriers. So we were very lucky about that. How many of you heard of the Battle of Midway? There's a movie, right? It just came out, I think, Midway. Didn't get such good reviews, but anyway, it just did come out. And actually, I live in Forest Hills. I live in 2 places. One of my other places is in Forest Hills, and there's a Midway movie theater. And I bet not one person in 1,000 knows why it's named the Midway movie theater. They may think it's the Midway from a circus. But it's named after the battle, which was a very important battle in World War II. It really turned the tide against the Japanese. Anyway, let me get back to the lecture. So, the Japanese invaded Manchuria, and in 1937, the Japanese launched a full-scale war into China. And so you had the Chinese and Japanese fighting. Italy also was against us in World War II, and they also, after World War I, they were our allies in World War I, and they felt discriminated against. They felt they didn't get by the terms of Versailles Peace Treaty. And in 1922, Benito Mussolini and his group of fascists took over the Italian government. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and 2 years later withdrew from the League of Nations in solidarity with Germany. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. He had become politically unpopular, as I mentioned before, because of the depression in the German economy, and he put people back to work, basically in the factories, and he drafted people into the army, men into the army, so they had work. As I mentioned, in 1932, half the German workers were unemployed. Hitler offered the people in Germany a vision of a great nation and pride in being members of the Aryan race. He also offered them employment. In 1936, Hitler marched 35,000 troops into the demilitarized zone known as the Rhineland. The British and French looked the other way and did nothing about the incursion. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria and signed an agreement with Britain and France that allowed it to annex the Sudetenland with a promise that Germany would not seek additional territory in Europe. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who signed the annexation agreement for Great Britain, told the world that the agreement had ensured peace for our time. He'd regret those words later. 6 months later, the Germans reneged on the agreement and annexed all of Czechoslovakia. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a pact that partitioned and annexed territories of their European neighbors. Stalin thought doing this could postpone going to war with Germany, which he thought would happen eventually, and have extra time to build up his forces. 9 days later, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days after that, Britain and France declared war on Germany, but there wasn't much fighting. Basically, there were declarations of war and not much fighting, and it's known as the phony war because there wasn't much fighting at that time. Following a period of relative quiet, the Germans began a blitzkrieg campaign. Blitzkrieg in Germany means lightning war, and they sent tanks and mechanized infantry speeding through enemy territory. From April to June of 1940, Germany conquered Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and France. Hitler then turned his attention to Britain, as Britain was the last man standing in Europe, but he had Winston Churchill to contend with. Churchill had become British Prime Minister after Chamberlain was forced from office, for appeasing the Germans by giving up the Sudetenland. Churchill said to his countrymen, his famous speech, "We shall defend our island. Whatever the cost may be, we shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." So Britain was hanging by a thread, and but for the Dunkirk evacuation, there was a movie about Dunkirk too, I think, right? Yeah. So basically what happened is the British Army was over in Europe, the Germans, the Blitzkrieg came through, the British had to retreat, and they retreated to the beaches of Dunkirk, and they were saved. 338,000 French and British troops were saved by a flotilla of British ships. Naval ships, tugboats, private yachts, they all came over and took the guys back to England. So that was a good thing. And so then Britain was the last man standing, so they all felt, well, that's Hitler's going to invade Britain, and people in Britain thought the same thing. And some of them said to the government officials, you know, we should just make a deal with Hitler. I mean, why should we fight Hitler? He's invaded all these countries in Europe. He's conquered all these countries. We're a small country. He'll conquer us. Why do we want to go through the pain of fighting to eventually be defeated? But there was one man basically that stood between that, and that was Winston Churchill, who said we're never going to give up. So Hitler's plan was to invade Britain, and the idea was to invade Britain because it's an island, you'd have to invade them with ships, and you'd have to get across the English Channel. And to get across the English Channel, you'd have to have control of the air. Because you didn't have control of the air, the British bombers would bomb your ships and you couldn't invade. So the plan was for the German Air Force to destroy the British planes in Britain. And so that was the plan, and they sent German bombers over to try to destroy the landing fields, the British landing fields, so the planes couldn't take off. And that happened for a while. And then Churchill sent British bombers over to bomb Germany. And Hitler got very upset that, you know, his cities were being bombed. And he decided, and he told the Air Force, don't bomb the landing fields, bomb the British cities. So then the German Air Force, instead of bombing the landing fields, started bombing London and Coventry and Liverpool, etc., and killing a lot of civilians. I think London lost 45,000 people during the bombing. And this famous film of this where the British, many British civilians are in the underground and the bombing and stiff upper lip and all the rest of this stuff. But it was a big mistake to bomb the cities. He really should have controlled his emotions and kept bombing the landing fields because the planes couldn't take off, you could have their invasion. But in the interim, because they could take off, the British planes were able to fight the German planes in the air and eventually defeat them in that the Germans didn't want to come back and fight anymore. And so there was a very famous statement that Churchill made acknowledging the bravery of the British pilots, and he said, you probably heard this, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, meaning the pilots. And ever since then, the British pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain have been referred to as the few. And they really turned the tide there. So Britain was saved, at least from invasion. Okay, so we talked about the Blitz, and then the next big mistake that Hitler made was something called Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion into the Soviet Union. That was probably Hitler's biggest mistake of the war, as the Eastern Front trapped the German Wehrmacht into a war of attrition and resulted in a disastrous defeat caused by the vast size of Russia's landmass, big country, and the Russian winter, which caused many German soldiers to freeze to death. Hitler thought it was going to be such a quick invasion that the German troops invading were not even issued winter uniforms. So when the winter came, they didn't even have warm coats. They had eventually got them, but so many German soldiers froze to death. It's a big mistake. So that was a problem. So as 1941 came to a close, the Germans were committed on three fronts: one against Britain in the west, one against the Russians in the east, and one in North Africa. Had that begun in 1940, where Germany was helping the Italians defeat the British and the British Commonwealth forces that were there. So there were basically three fronts at the end of 1941. So in December 7th, 1941, of course, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And interestingly, 4 days after that, Germany declared war on the United States. Didn't have to do that, because Germany had a pact with Japan that if Japan was attacked, Germany would go to their aid. But Japan wasn't attacked. There was no pact that if Japan did the attacking, that Germany would go to their aid. But Hitler declared war on the United States anyway, because he felt eventually, I guess, he was going to have to fight the United States. And that was obviously a big mistake. I wouldn't say probably, but that was obviously a big mistake. And there's a, Churchill, when he heard about Pearl Harbor, said he got the first good night's sleep in a long time, because he knew the United States was going to come into the war against Germany, and that was going to save Britain. And it did. Basically because the United States had such a big population, so we could send so many soldiers and airmen and sailors into the fight, but also we had such a big production capacity. During the war, we were producing for everybody, sending stuff to the Soviets, to the British, to anyone who was fighting, basically. We were called the arsenal of democracy, and basically we were. Okay, so at the beginning of World War II, the Japanese made big gains in the Western Pacific, taking places like Wake Island, Guam, the Solomon Islands, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. But as I said before, their advances were stopped at the Battle of Midway. And that was an immense stroke of luck. As I said, the aircraft carriers had not been bombed in Pearl Harbor. Germany and Italy had some successes in North Africa, but they could not sustain their military campaign there. And in May 1943, they were defeated. The Germans sustained even a bigger defeat in 1943 when they were being beaten decisively at Stalingrad. You probably heard the Battle of Stalingrad. Huge battle. According to the research I did, almost 2 million people were killed, wounded, or captured at Stalingrad. I mean, it's almost an impossible figure to imagine. And Stalingrad marked the first time that the Nazi government publicly acknowledged a failure in its war effort. Germany's defeat at Stalingrad shattered its reputation for invincibility and dealt a devastating blow to German morale. Among the Allied forces, the Russians did most of the heavy lifting against the Germans, as evidenced by the statistic that 90% of German troops killed in World War II died fighting on the Eastern Front. You know, we think about the Western Front or the battles that the Americans fought. It was true, and we killed many German soldiers, the troops did, but the Russians really did most of the heavy lifting in World War II. On July 9, 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. A little over a month later, the island was theirs, which paved the way for an invasion of Italy that took place on September 3rd. The Allies also won a series of victories in the Pacific. In 1944, the Western Allies invaded German-occupied France. That's the famous D-Day invasion in Normandy, starring Tom Hanks. Just kidding about the last part. Anyway, that was it was the largest seaborne invasion in history, and was commanded by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who in the 1950s would become a two-term president. Now, originally, that invasion really should have been commanded by George Marshall, who was in rank above Eisenhower. But Roosevelt didn't want Marshall to be the commander of that invasion because he felt Marshall was such a good planner. He wanted Marshall in Washington so he could do the planning and also explain to Roosevelt what was going on. So the story is Marshall comes into the office, and Roosevelt felt, though, that if Marshall wanted to do the invasion, he would let him do it. And so when Marshall came into the office, he said to Marshall, well, I'm thinking of appointing any commanders for invasion. I know you're next in line, but I've been thinking of someone else, but if you want to do it, I'll appoint you. And Marshall said, well, you're the president. You pick who you think you want to select. And he picked Eisenhower. And I'm guessing, had he picked Marshall, Marshall would have been president during during the 50s if he was interested, because you really couldn't beat a war hero in the 50s. And Eisenhower was going to win whether he ran as a Republican or a Democrat. And people didn't know, actually, till a few years right before he decided to run, because after the war he didn't say which he was. So both parties wanted him to run on their party. Okay, with their party. So during 1944 and 1945, the Japanese suffered major reverses in mainland Asia and in central China, South China, and Burma, when the Allies crippled the Japanese Navy and captured key western Pacific islands such as Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. In these battles, the Japanese, who had pledged their lives to the emperor, either fought to the death or committed suicide. The Japanese also instigated kamikaze attacks that involved having pilots fly their planes into Allied ships. The kamikaze attacks resulted in the deaths of 3,800 Japanese pilots and 7,000 U.S. naval personnel. And it's really hard to fight an enemy that doesn't care if they die. I mean, typically, normal war, when you fight, and when you surround soldiers, and they see they can't win, they surrender, and you take them prisoner. Not the Japanese. Typically, the Japanese would fight to the death, they wouldn't surrender, they'd either kill themselves or run out shooting, which is a tough enemy to fight, and when I get to the part about dropping the atom bomb, was one of the reasons why Truman made the decision to drop the atom bomb on Japan, because of the nature of the foe. So the war in Europe concluded with an invasion of Germany by the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, culminating in the capture of Berlin by Soviet troops. Now, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, he told the soldiers, do whatever you want to do over there. You know, you want to plunder, you want to rape, you know, whatever you do, it's okay with me. And they did that. I mean, they basically destroyed the country. Many women were raped in the Soviet Union. And of course, when the Soviets then came back and invaded Germany, there was vengeance and turnabout is fair play. And if you were a woman in Germany, you kind of knew that you were really going to be subject to rape. And they estimate 2 million German women were raped by the Soviets coming in. So that was, I mean, you know, they felt turnabout is fair play. Anyway, Hitler was in Berlin when the city was invaded, and a couple weeks earlier, Mussolini was captured by Italian partisans and hung in a public square with his mistress. These dictators like mistresses. Hitler had a mistress also, right, Eva Braun? And his body was mutilated, and Hitler obviously felt that if he was there, he was going to be captured, and who knows what would happen to him. So he committed suicide. At least that's what we think from the eyewitness news reports. There are books that say Hitler escaped. And you can read some of those books, but anyway, from what I've done the research and what most people think, is that Hitler in fact did commit suicide. He shot himself. His mistress, Eva Braun, according to the people who were there, committed suicide by taking poison. And to test out the poison, Hitler liked dogs, it turned out. See, people aren't all bad. He liked dogs. So basically, to test out the poison, he tested it out on his dog, who died. And since the poison was good, so Eva Braun could take the poison, and she died too. Okay, so that was the end of Germany. Then there was VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, where we defeated Germany. But then, of course, we had the other foe, which was the Japanese. They were still fighting. So on July 26, 1945, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, which defined the terms for a Japanese surrender. The Japanese refused those terms. This was an unconditional surrender. The Japanese refused those terms, and after bombing raids on Japan that left 250,000 Japanese dead, and more than died in the atomic bomb attacks on Japan. And the reason so many Japanese died is because the Japanese cities, many of them had these wooden buildings. So when you drop these bombs, the fires in the cities were so devastating that there was a raid in Tokyo, I think killed more than 100,000 people through the fires, not so much the actual bombs itself. But in any event, the Japanese still would not surrender, even though 250,000 would be killed in bombing raids. So Harry Truman, who was the president at that time, Franklin Roosevelt had died, and by the way, Franklin Roosevelt served how many terms? four terms of office. And when he ran for the fourth term, he was a very sick person, I mean physically sick. And people around him thought he might not last. And I'm guessing he thought the same thing. But you know, he wanted to finish the job, and so, but he died in office, and his vice president became president. And the interesting thing is, Truman did not know about the atom bomb until he became president, because Roosevelt never invited Truman into the cabinet meetings, and basically didn't tell him things. So as vice president, he really didn't know anything. Actually, vice president used to be a great job if you were like a writer, because you had so much time on your hands. It was just a no-show job, basically. So when Truman showed up and was president, he was told about the atom bomb. It was his decision to drop the bomb. And the military said, you know, we have a couple of bombs that we've been making, and you can drop them on Japan, and these bombs will kill a lot of people, or we can invade Japan, do a traditional invasion. But if we invade Japan, we're going to lose hundreds of thousands of soldiers, because the Japanese will never give in, even though they'll lose eventually. But there won't be any surrender. They'll fight to the last, and we'll have to go slowly, and we'll lose all these people. And Truman said, well, let's drop the bomb. And so, in fact, they did. They dropped the bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and killed 130,000 people. At that point, the Emperor of Japan, because one of the reasons the Japanese were such zealots was because they felt they were fighting for the emperor, who was divine. He wasn't just a human being, he was sort of a godlike presence. So when they died, they were dying for the divine emperor. So the emperor had to make the decision to surrender. And so after the second Japanese city was atom bombed, he said, okay, I'm throwing in the towel. And some in the military, the Japanese military, were very upset. They wanted to fight to the last. But he made the decision to surrender. And so when he did that, the Japanese announced their intention to surrender on August 15, 1945, which cemented total victory in Asia for the Allies. So after the war, there were criminal trials, the Nuremberg trials. You've probably heard of those. By the way, it wasn't just the Nuremberg trials for the war crime tribunals. There were dozens of trials all over Europe. Nuremberg was the most famous. Had Hitler lived, I suspect he would have been tried and executed. One of the questions people have is, why wasn't the emperor put on trial? And the reason is Douglas MacArthur, who was taking over after Japan lost the war. Douglas MacArthur was the governor of Japan, and he told Truman, we really should not try the emperor, because the Japanese people will be very upset if we do, and the emperor is cooperating with us in pacifying the Japanese people. The emperor said, I'm no longer divine, I'm just a regular person who's a leader, so that was a big deal, and so we really should not put the emperor on trial. So the emperor lucked out. He wasn't put on trial, but he should have been. By the way, had the Germans and Japanese won the war, they would have put maybe some of our people on trial, so it's a good idea to win wars. Okay. Anyway, World War II changed the political alignment and social structure of the world. The Soviet Union annexed countries and established spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, and the United Nations was established to foster international cooperation and prevent future conflicts. The Soviet Union and the United States emerged as rival superpowers, setting the stage for a nearly half-century Cold War, during which time NATO was created to defend Europe from the Red Army. In the wake of European devastation, the influence of its great powers waned, triggering the decolonization of Africa and Asia. The British gave up India. Winston Churchill felt very bad about that. India, Malaya, and Burma. The Dutch gave up Indonesia. The French were stubborn and resisted decolonization. So the French had Algeria and Indochina, which they didn't give up. Eventually they did after they lost tens of thousands of soldiers. You know, the French lost in 1954 in Vietnam at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Charles de Gaulle was the leader. And he told Eisenhower at that time, don't do anything about Vietnam, let it go. But that's another lecture. Most countries whose industries have been damaged moved towards economic recoveries and expansion, which was helped by the United States in the form of the Marshall Plan. So George Marshall got some recognition. He created this Marshall Plan where we gave lots of aids to Europe. America came out of the war with its infrastructure intact and twice as rich as when it entered the war, with a vastly enlarged manufacturing capability. So all you know, if you're old enough, and I suspect some of you are, to live through the 50s, the 50s was so good economically because of World War II. Basically, we were manufacturing stuff for the world because Europe had been devastated, Japan had been devastated, China had been devastated, the Soviet Union had been devastated. We were fine. I mean, they didn't attack the mainland, so we could produce stuff and send it all over the world. That's when you had those good union-paying jobs. And when Trump says, "Make America Great Again," I think most people, or many people, think of the 50s. Anyway, we were the main supplier of goods to the world. We also, World War II one of the things that came out of World War II was political integration, especially in Europe. You had the European Union, where the idea was, instead of fighting each other, let's band together as countries economically. And so one of the fears today is that the European Union breaks up, will there have more of a possibility of war happen because of a breakup? Because now the countries don't have a reason to stay together economically. Let's hope that doesn't happen. In any event, let me just, I have a few other things to say, but before I do that, any questions or comments?
Have you ever been, sorry,
Yeah.
have you ever been to Hiroshima or Nagasaki?
No. Have you?
Yes.
And so what do you think?
Well, it's very somber. It's a very complete, it was a Sunday morning, I believe. It was women, children, grandparents. I mean, it was full.
Yeah.
It was a civilian target. So I
Yeah.
personally, I mean, I was not even born then.
Right.
Never followed on civilian targets. But they say it saved many American lives. But I think at that point, Japan probably was already on the scene. But again, it was before my time.
Well, no, it's before my time too. But the point, that's a good point. And actually, the Soul Library, there are people on both sides of that issue. People that say we should have gone. I happen to be on the side that says we should have, but that's okay. There's other people that say we shouldn't, and you can read more about it. You can make arguments either way. Yes?
Do you think Germany has become superpower of Europe because all of its industry was destroyed in the war and therefore it built new technology?
We can make that argument. What do you think?
Well, I think yes. I think actually in a way losing was better. I mean, not really, but in terms of getting new technology on the ground, yeah, absolutely.
And losing can be better. Remember the movie The Mouse That Roared?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so losing wars against the United States can be good. Yeah, you're right. The housing is more modern, because you get rid of the old housing. It's not the greatest way to do it because so many people die, but it's an interesting argument. Okay, yes.
Why did Hitler go against Russia? Weren't they allies at first?
They were, but they were allies of convenience. I mean, basically, Hitler really wanted to invade Russia, but he didn't want to invade Russia right then. So to postpone any possibility that Stalin might think he's going to invade, he said, we'll make a pact. Stalin knew that Germany was eventually going to invade Russia. I mean, the roadmap was there from World War I. Hitler was interested in invading, he wanted living space, and that was everywhere. So pretty much everyone knew that was going to happen. One of Hitler's big mistakes was he should have waited. I mean, by the way, in retrospect, we're all geniuses looking back, right? So I'd sound like, I know what I'm talking about, but only because I see the mistakes. Everyone does. Had he waited a couple more years, he could actually, had he waited and not declared war on the United States for a couple more years, he could have built up his own forces. But you're eager to get into the fight, and so he probably did it too early. But yeah. Yes.
I think that this government at the time didn't realize that by signing up with the Versailles peace treaty and putting Germany on your knees,
Right.
would open up the country for what came a few years later with Hitler. And usually we ignore history and we repeat our
Right.
errors.
Right. Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it, the famous saying by George Santayana. Although I disagree, because I don't think history does repeat itself. I mean, things are always happening that are new. You can learn from the past, but it's tricky. And actually, it's interesting that in the 19th century, the French and Germans fought in the Franco-Prussian War, which the Germans won. And they took Alsace-Lorraine, which was really very upsetting to the French. One of the reasons why the French went into World War I was to get back Alsace-Lorraine. And so basically, the Germans won, and the Germans put big reparations on the French, bigger than the reparations that the Allies put on the Germans after World War I. And the French paid it back early. So one of the problems for Germany wasn't so much that the reparations were high, which they were, the depression and the inflation in Germany made it very hard to pay the money back. If it was just normal times, they might have been able to pay that money back. But the economy during the 20s for the Germans, the inflation there was so bad, they couldn't pay the money back. So that was a tough break. But you're right. Had they not put on those reparations so much, it might have tamped down the anger of the people to want to vote for a guy like Hitler.
And George Marshall understood that very well, because when the war was over, the first thing he said, let's help them out to get back on their knees as soon as possible. And they planned an economic plan of recovery of all of Europe, Germany, Italy, France, regarding whether they were allied or not.
Well, that's right. And actually, Marshall, you can consider that altruistic, really trying to help these people. But there's also some element of selfishness in that if these people aren't helped and we're making all the products and they don't have money to buy it, what's the sense? So we also want to see them prosper so they can buy our products. So it was a double thing. But basically, we certainly did a lot of help there with the Marshall Plan. And Marshall was esteemed for being a humanitarian. By the way, Herbert Hoover was also a great humanitarian. I'll just throw that in, because Hoover's always getting trashed for things, but he was a great humanitarian. Anyway, some other things about World War II, just interesting things. Hitler was a vegetarian. I did not drink or smoke. So he wanted to be healthy. Too bad. Anyway, in 1938, Hitler was Time's Man of the Year. Volkswagen was introduced during the Nazi time, and Volkswagen means the people's car, right? Hitler felt very burdened by having Italy as an ally. He says anything would have been better than having Italians as comrades in arms. So he was always happy to send reinforcements to help the Italians in the fight. I think the Italians didn't have their heart in it. So Hitler felt very bad about having Mussolini as an ally. The swastika, by the way, was a symbol in the Indian subcontinent. It was a religious symbol. It wasn't this terrible symbol we think today that has to be banned. It shows how symbols can change. Even I know I live in Queens, there's a couple of buildings that have swastikas in the tile in the lobbies that were put in before the war. And no one thought that was such a bad symbol. It was only when Hitler appropriated the symbol that it became this terrible symbol. The U-boats almost won the war for Germany. And that's why if Hitler had waited and built more U-boats, he might have had a chance to win the war. Because the U-boats were very successful in the beginning of the war. And afterwards, when the radar got better and we could see more, etc. But had there been more U-boats, it would have been a real problem, but there wasn't. The German foreign minister, a guy by the name of Joachim von Ribbentrop, said the 3 reasons why Germany lost the war was A, Russian resistance, B, Americans' industrial power, and C, not enough German air power. See, had the Germans had enough air power, they could have won the Battle of Britain, taken over Britain, that would have been a big deal. But again, Hitler didn't wait long enough to build up those things. But I guess it's hard if you're a dictator to wait you know, you're so anxious to win. Winning's a big deal. Okay. Anyway, as I said, World War II is the last good war. And of course, some of the controversy of the atom bomb is a big deal. Another controversy is whether FDR did enough to save the Jews in concentration camps. This is a big controversy because the tracks leading to the camps weren't bombed, they weren't singled out. And so people argue, make the case, and there's lots of books I'm sure in the library on this, that FDR should have done more to help the Jews. Now, one of the reasons that FDR didn't do as much to help the Jews is that there's always anti-Semitism, but there was lots of anti-Semitism in the 30s. And so one of the thoughts was that if FDR went against the concentration camps and bombed it, people would say, well, we're only going into World War II to help the Jews. So not to have that as an argument, FDR, one of the reasons he wouldn't do it. Also, many of the people in the military didn't want to do it, and the State Department, which is actually fairly anti-Semitic, was telling FDR not to do anything, not to bomb the tracks, and not to diminish what was going on in the concentration camps. They get to that later. But that's a big controversy that today people talk about, books have been written about it. It's not clear one way or the other, but certainly what's interesting about World War II, same thing with the atom bomb and dropping in Japan, is the more you read about it, the more you can come to your own conclusions. And knowledge is power. The more knowledge you have about these subjects, the more you can advance an informed opinion. So let me see if there's anything else. Could the West have prevented Stalin from taking over? Oh yeah. The one other thing is, after World War II, or Russia took over all these Eastern European countries. And the term Iron Curtain was a term that Winston Churchill first used in a speech in Missouri in 1945. He said, an iron curtain is now descended all over Europe, meaning that the Soviet Union had taken over all these countries. And so Roosevelt, many people hold it against Roosevelt for doing that. But that's a controversy whether he should we have fought the Soviet Union after World War II so they couldn't have taken over those countries? Some people here said we should. But that certainly is a controversy. Anyway, you've been a great audience. I want to thank you. Come back into the library for one of the great programs.